with it. You will be carried off with it. So when we look at this verse, these verses this morning, we discover that in Malachi chapter number 1, from verse 6 through chapter 2 through verse number 9, is that a rebuke of the priest. But then we see that Malachi exposes their specific sins in Malachi chapter number 1, verses 6 through 14. You could also find that in your time of study, that you can go back and look and see in Malachi chapter number 1, verses 6 through 14, as he gives us the description of the specific sins in verses 6 through 14. Then he graphically describes how they would be disciplined right here in our text in chapter number 2 in verses 1 through 4, how they would be disciplined. But his opening address is directly to identify them and suggested that there would be no lessonness of severity of announcement of punishment. He says in verse number 1, look at what he says in verse number 1. He says, and now you priests, this warning is for who? You. He said, this warning is for the priests. He says, their just judgment was sealed and there was no hope of escape. When he says this, he said, in other words, when he says, and now you priests, that this warning is for you. There is no way that they can escape this. Now, he also says in verse number 2, he said there's no way they can escape this. This lesson is addressed particularly to the priest as a special divine commandment. Besides the prophets and the kings, the priests were divinely appointed leaders of the people, teachers of Israel, a court of appeals. The honorable position demanded a corresponding faithfulness in performance, varied with duties. The Lord urged him to hear and to give a wholehearted attention to his words. When he says the words, now you priests, this warning is for you. He's simply giving them urging them to listen, to give their whole attention to his words so they might, in execution of their duties, given a proper honor and glory to the Lord's holy name. And he says in verse number 2, he says, if you do not listen, he says, if you do not listen, if you do not resolve to honor my name, says the Lord Almighty, I will send a curse on you. I will curse your blessings. Yes, I have already cursed them because you have not resolved to honor me. When he says, if you do not listen, if you do not resolve to honor my name, further revealed that the possibility of their avoiding their punishment was fast approaching. Because when he says this, the Lord has promised the priests that their blessings would be God's blessings. Since they refused to obey the Lord, he will also change their blessings and turn them into curses. He says, if you don't take heed, if you don't listen, he says, I'll take your blessings and curse them. And he said, I've already began to curse them and everyone of their own blessings, whether they were repetition of God's benediction or blessings of their own intervention intended to impart divine favor, well-being upon the people. The benediction blessing was undoubtedly a standard blessing used in the Jerusalem temple. At the conclusion of worship, like pastors in churches today, the priests in the ancient Israel had the privilege of giving the blessing. For Malachi, however, God's judgment against the priests twists the solemn blessings into a curse. What would that be like today if God would tell the priest that if you don't do and you don't listen, he says, I'm going to take the blessing that is given at the benediction and turn it into a curse. And he says, and then he goes on and says, and it says already had begun. The Lord would corrupt their seed, which literally means the Lord would rebuke and scold and threaten their seed. He said, I will corrupt their seed. Gives the sense that this curse is to affect the productivity of the land, so that the revenue of the priests will be reduced, which means that even the productivity would be reduced because of the priests would fail to listen and be obedient to God. Because there is a consequence when you are disobedient to God. But then what he says in verse 3, he says, how do we know he's gonna corrupt the descendants? Verse 3. Verse 3 says, because of you, I will rebuke your descendants. I will smear on your face dung from the festival sacrifice. This dung that he's talking about, he says, I'm going to spread the dung on your face. This is the filth from the intestines of the sacrificed animals. He said, this is a strong expression indicating humiliation and shame awaiting the priest as they defiled the altar of God with their blemished sacrifice. You got to remember, because of that, the corruptedness that was going on, of the cynical mood of that day, of that time, the priests had started putting blemished and blind, lame sacrifices that was imperfect on the altar. He says to them, they themselves would be defiled, and furthermore, God will put them out of his presence. Look what he says. He's not only I will put dung and bring humiliation upon them on their face. He said, but you will be carried off with it. He said, in other words, you will deposit off with it. You will be carried off with it. He said, defile the priest, and he says God will put them out of his presence. Defile the priest, unfit the demands of the duty, would be carried off and deposit with the dung on the city's dumping ground. If they fail to serve as a true priest. So we know that those who are spiritual leaders and those who are of priestly duties are if we don't do as spiritual leaders what we've been called to do, God says he will turn our blessings into a curse. I don't know our blessing into a curse. He says we have already began with the curse. Then he says in verse 3, he tells that he gives our descendants as well. But then look what he says in verse number 4. Verse 4 through 6 deals with the priest worthy of his calling. He says in verse 4, he says in verse 4, he says, and you will know that I have sent you this warning, so that my covenant with Levi may continue, says the Lord Almighty. He says, in other words, after I have deposited, the priest would be carried off and deposited with it. God's purpose was to shake them out of their complacency, bring them back to their original purpose. He says, you will know this. You will know this, that my covenant with Levi, with the Lord of hosts. My covenant was with him of life and peace. And he says, you will know that, says the Lord Almighty. Because in order to picture this gross imperfection of the presence of the priest, the prophet paints a vivid picture, perhaps somewhat idolized, a more perfect priesthood imitated by God's covenant with Levi. Levi, the third son of Jacob. Now, he said not only he does this, but God's purpose was to shake them out of their complacency and bring them back to the original purpose. Leaders today would do well to heed divine purpose, God's divine purpose for their position in his church, and to seek them as